Good evening, everybody. I'm Kate Genovese. I'm the host of Table Talk. And tonight we have a wonderful guest, a wonderful lady who wrote her fourth book. It's called The Tin Ticket, and it is based on a true story. And her name is Deborah Swiss, and she's here with us tonight.
Thank you.
So glad you're here. I'm just so impressed by your book. I have to say I haven't finished it yet. I got it from your publisher just like a week ago, it's just mind-boggling how much research you did. But before we get into it, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. Well, this is my fourth book. My first three books were about women in the workplace, working moms, and gender equity. And then I kind of put writing aside to work full-time and raise my children and get them through college. And 6 years ago, I went to Tasmania with the idea of writing an environmental article, and I signed up for 2 wilderness treks, which is a story in itself. And in a post office between treks, I happened to meet a Tasmanian artist, Christina Henry, who turned around and, not knowing I'm a writer, said, "I have a story I want to tell you." Wow. And I never wrote the environmental article, and instead I ended up spending 6.5 years of work discovering the incredible journey of the 25,000 girls and women who were shipped to Australia as tamers and breeders when the British wanted to beat the French in colonizing Australia. But I think the best part of this story is that history doesn't have to be dull, because I'm telling the history through the lives of 3 women, and last year I went and stayed with their descendants who graciously invited me into their homes.
Now, how far back are the descendants?
Well, for some it's great-great-grandmothers, and some it's great-great-great-great-great-grandmothers.
What year is this that it's taking place?
The women were transported from 1788 to 1868, and the women I wrote about were about 1830s. So, and they were very well documented. But the interesting part of the story is it is a very sad story. Women shipped to the other side of the world, in total 162,000 men, women, and children shipped by their own government, just really for the crime of poverty. Most people stole food or clothing, and for that they're shipped to the other side of the world, exiled for life. But the best part of the story is that these women were remarkable survivors. Through their friendship and humor and rebellion, they survived, and they went on to become loving moms and grandmothers, and they really formed the society that was the most progressive in the world at the time. In Australia, at the time convicts were freed, 40% of the population were convicts, and Australia was the second place after New Zealand that women received the right to vote, and one of the first places to have a union movement. And as I meet their descendants, since 1 in 5 Australians are descended today from these folks, I see, these feisty, funny, strong, warm people, and I can't help but think that, these are many of the traits that were passed down from their great-great-grandmothers.
Could I just ask you, and maybe for some of the listeners that don't know, because I personally had to look up where Tasmania was exactly.
Well, me too. I really, when I went there with the idea of writing an environmental article, the reason I chose it was because it's known for having the cleanest air on the planet because of the wind currents. And I actually had to look it up on a map.
Yeah.
So it's the little island state off the southeast coast of Australia. And it used to be called Van Diemen's Land, and actually the name was changed to cover up all this convict history. The British government wanted to make nice and cover it all up.
Yeah.
So half the women who were shipped, about 12,000, went to Tasmania, then known as Van Diemen's Land, and half to mainland Australia.
So some of them in the beginning of the book, the 2 women were in Scotland.
Yes, yes.
So it was Scottish women?
Yeah, they were from England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Yeah.
Okay, I had heard, just through history, that men were transported, and I had no idea women were. And what got me is they called it, they looked at it like it is a crime to be poor.
Yes.
Which was so sad. I was reading the beginning of the book, getting angry as a woman, especially reading what they went through.
Yep. Well, that's what also got me all riled up. My other books were about kind of gender equity in the workplace, and this is still about gender and power. And what kind of propelled me through the many all-nighters that were required to finish the book and get it to press, when thinking, I was reading about in Victorian times, if a man committed a crime, society deemed him capable of reform and redemption. But for a woman, she was bad forever. I was thinking, what's this about? This doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
But the interesting part of that story is that I also asked myself, didn't anyone in the world care about the fact that these poor women were shipped for stealing stockings or clothing or a loaf of bread? Spoons. Yeah, spoons.
I couldn't believe
They're
it.
exiled for life. Didn't anyone care or speak up? And the answer is a resounding yes. There was one woman, Elizabeth Gurney Fry, a Quaker reformer, who was a radical woman of the day. And the interesting part of her story is she had 11 children and was criticized in the press for leaving her children to do this social activism, for leaving them in the care of a nanny. So criticized for being a working mom in the 1800s. But she started saying, we're just punishing these people because they're poor. Why don't we think about educating them or teaching their children to read? And she actually met half of the women who were transported. Before they were transported, she went into Newgate Jail, brought them clean clothing, set up a schoolroom for their children, and gave them a little sewing packet. So while they were at sea for 4 months with a 12,000-mile trip to Australia, the girls and women learned how to sew, so they learned a skill. And actually, there was one quilt that is the only known one to survive by the Raja, which is the name of one of the ships, that only comes out once a year in Sydney, Australia. And it has the names of the women who helped make it, and it also has their blood, sweat, and tears on it. So this is, women's history. The artifacts of women's history are, not necessarily about battles and bloodshed, but it's about their daily lives and how they survived.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this must have been incredible for research. Mm-hmm. I mean, I know I've written some books, and my latest I had to do quite a bit of research, not so much on people, but the situations and, the times, So I did an awful lot. It took up a lot of time. And when I saw your bibliography, I couldn't get over it. So you must have spent hours upon hours, or not even weeks, doing your research.
Well, I had to buy 6.5 years. I had to buy another bookcase for all my books.
Yeah.
But what's interesting about researching these women is they were very well documented, and I know the color of their eyes, whether they had a clear skin or whether they were pockmarked. That Agnes Macmillan married a free convict man who had dark, bushy eyebrows that met in the middle. He had a unibrow, and he had a big scar from tuberculosis, but he had a job. And she fell in love. When he had his certificate of freedom, it's documented that he was riding through a little town in Tasmania, waving his certificate of freedom he was drunk, on a wild horse. And she saw him and fell in love, and they went on to raise many generations of wonderful people.
Now, why, to back up just a tiny bit, why did they send them there to Australia? Is it because they wanted to populate?
Yes, they wanted to beat the French to colonize Australia because they wanted the rich resources of timber and flax to build their empire. And they actually put ads in the local newspapers looking for women and girls who would go to Australia and at their own expense. And of course, a few people, responded, but not many. It's like going to Mars in those days.
Think about it.
So they didn't get enough women that way, and they wanted women as tamers and breeders. So what they did is there was an old piece of legislation called the Transportation Act that it said if you commit any crime, whether it's stealing a loaf of bread, felony, whatever, you can be imprisoned in any colony. So they used this once the British government abolished slavery. They really called it something else. They called it the Transportation Act, and essentially enslaved 162,000 of their own citizens, really, and sent them to the other side of the world. And it was covered up for nearly a century. The name Van Diemen's Land was changed to Tasmania. Records were dumped in the ocean. And they actually in Australia had to start guarding some of the archives because people who were descended from convicts were going in and destroying the records and trying to erase the convict stain. But today, generally Australians think it's cool to have a convict ancestor because these were amazing survivors and they're proud of it.
Well, in the beginning of the book, you can tell the two main characters initially, you can tell they're feisty.
Yeah.
It's almost like they were just waiting for something to happen.
Right.
You know, they thought they knew how to steal properly, and
Right.
yet they didn't from the rich.
Right.
And it made me think of what the wealthy people were thinking of the very, very poor.
Mm-hmm.
You know, did they not care? Is it much like today?
They didn't care.
You know,
They didn't care. And that's really a theme that kind of touched my heart, you know, how one person can make a difference. You know, Elizabeth Gurney Fry dealt with half of the transported women, 12,000 people, had her volunteers sewing clothes for their children who were in prison with them and in many cases shipped with them. She set up soup kitchens for the homeless. She trained nurses. She went into London streets and vaccinated. But generally, the rich just wanted the poor out of sight, and that was another part of why these people were shipped, because out of sight, out of mind.
Mm-hmm.
And in the aftermath of the Irish potato famine, if an Irish person looked the wrong way, they were transported. There was terrible discrimination
Mm-hmm.
against the Irish. As a matter of fact, one of the women I mentioned is Bridget Mulligan, and she stole a tin of milk and a petticoat with her best friend, and for that she shipped to Van Diemen's Land. But the interesting part of her story is that her great-great-grandma was last year nominated for Australian Hero of the Year.
Her great-great-grandmother,
Mm-hmm,
oh my
mm-hmm.
gosh.
She had 70, she's a retired mayor of a very gritty town in northern Tasmania, and at 73 she runs a soup kitchen for the homeless 4 days a week. So if her great-great-grandma Bridget Mulligan hadn't had the courage and the strength to survive, this beautiful person wouldn't be here today. And last year I went and stayed with all the descendant families, and we followed the trail of their great-great-grandmas.
And so how long did you stay?
It was 2 weeks of just nonstop driving 600 kilometers a day and going into used bookstores and archives and old records. And together we found some things that they didn't know about their ancestors, which really was so much fun.
And earlier in our conversation before this interview, you were saying that you were glad you were finally done with the book, but yet you're so passionate about it, you can't stop talking about it because you feel the characters are within you.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain? You want to explain that a
know,
little bit?
Is there a special
character that?
Well, it took me a long time to find the right voice for this book, because my other books were more journalistic reporting. I do big, massive surveys and write. They're more like business books for women in the workplace. But I didn't want to write a traditional history book with facts and figures, because a few other books that have been written about these women, mostly about Australians, just talk about the numbers and the general history. And I thought, but what were their lives like? And what was the backstory? They just talked about how getting to Australia.
Mm-hmm.
So it took me a long time, and also to find the right women to write about, because I wanted women who survived, not everyone who survived. And as I came to know them, I started asking myself, how did they find that little kernel of humanity that enabled them to go on another day? And that's what drew me into them. I discovered, for instance, Agnes Macmillan in her court records, when she was arrested the first time, revealed that she was a ballad singer. So then I had to go and think, okay, well, what ballads were passed on by the oral tradition to women in Scotland? So that led me on that little trail. And then I thought, aboard ship, they slept on a board 18 inches across. And what did they do below decks when they were, at night? The hatches were battened down in the 4-month ship journey. What did they do? Well, I found it in a diary written by a minister who had been on one of these voyages. He wrote that the girls were all given Bibles, which was ludicrous because they couldn't read. So below decks, they used the Bibles to make playing cards. Or,
Very resourceful.
Very resourceful. Or they would take little pieces of paper and use it to curl their hair, which is ingenious.
Yeah. Well, they were trying to make the best of it. Instead of looking at it negatively, they had this positive attitude. Now, did they have a spirituality, do you think, that helped augment what was their characters?
The poor often didn't go to church and what we'd consider traditional religion, because they worked often 7 days a week, and there was really no time. But one of the things I discovered is that once the girls were in Van Diemen's Land, there were documented incidents in the press, because the papers had nothing to do but write about these, people who they termed wild creatures.